Hello again to Word Crumbs. Today is Saturday of the 23rd week in Ordinary Time. And today I'd just like to do a little summary of the 2 weeks of reflections that we have been praying about, which basically touches on the theme of a discipleship of depth, of how St. Luke presents Jesus calling us to understand our Christianity beyond just rules, but by a way of life that he himself teaches us. So just prepare yourself. It's going to be a bit dense, but it's going to help us to understand what this discipleship of depth has been and how the Gospel of Luke calls us to a very concrete deepening of Christianity. So as a little recap, if we remember, we were invited first of all to examine whether our Christianity is just set on rules, obeying rules, doing religious practices like the Sabbath, like fasting, and whether we are able to go beyond understanding what is the spirit of these rules and regulations or even religious practices that we have in our Christian faith. So Jesus asks us to go beyond, not to ignore the rules, not to ignore the norms or the practices, but to go beyond to see that it's about Him. If you remember that He is still the Lord of the Sabbath. It's about Jesus. It's about getting to know God more. It's about loving God more. And it's about loving our fellow human beings and caring for their welfare more. So when religious practices or religious rules make us love God less, or in the sense know Him less for who He is, and it makes us less charitable to others, then we need to examine, maybe I've missed the spirit of the law, and I need to come back to the core of what Christianity is about. And so Jesus brings us one step further to go beyond just the practice of religious rules, like going to church or like praying our devotions, but to understand that it's about our way of life. How do I live? Who is God for me? If you remember these questions, who is God for me? Who am I for Him? Who are we for God? And how are we meant to live? Why has He given us the gift of life so that we can live in a certain way to make this world a better place, to make life for all a better experience? So in Luke chapter 6, Jesus begins to speak about the Beatitudes. So this was the second step, if you like. So the first step was to say, let's not just be set on rules, on religious practices, the externals, if you like. Let us go to the core, which is our way of life. To learn to examine, how am I living and imitating Jesus in the way I live? To be detached from riches, if you remember, by living the evangelical counsel of poverty. To be detached from the pleasures of this world, just by the moderation of the counsel of chastity, of purity of heart, of mind, and the detachment from fame, honors, living according to the opinions or our reputation, by learning how to hunger for the right things, to obey the will of God, to obey the will of love, and to find our dignity, our so-called good reputation in front of God and not in front of human beings. So the Beatitudes introduced us into this new way of living, of freedom in actual fact, that Jesus asks us to live, or invites us to live. A life of Christian freedom. Freedom from being attached to things, to the opinions of people, and even to our own pride, in order that we could live in the freedom of loving God, loving others, as we love ourselves. Now, there's much more that we can talk about regarding the evangelical counsels and the way of life Jesus invites us. So today, I'd just like to give certain tools that we can use, tools meaning points of reflection that we can use to deepen on these aspects. And it comes actually with the summary of today. And the summary is taken from Luke chapter 6, verses 43 until the end of the chapter. Luke 6, 43 to the end of the chapter, which is the gospel of today. I'll just read certain parts of it that will be relevant for this reflection. So Jesus says, "There is no sound tree that produces rotten fruit, nor again a rotten tree that produces sound fruit. Every tree can be told by its own fruit. People do not pick figs from thorns, nor gather grapes from brambles. Good people draw what is good from the store of goodness in their hearts. Bad people draw what is bad from the store of badness. For the words of the mouth flow out of what fills the heart." And then he says, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I say? Everyone who comes to me and listens to my words and acts on them, I will show you what such a person is like. Such a person is like the man who, when he built a house, dug and dug deep and laid the foundations on rock. When the river was in flood, it bore down on that house, but could not shake it. It was so well built. But someone who listens and does nothing is like the man who built a house on soil, with no foundations, and as soon as the river bore down on it, it collapsed. And what a ruin that house became." Now, as we continue in this reflection, I'll just try to explain a little bit of this gospel of today, and we can bring it back again to our reflection on a discipleship of depth. That once again, basically, the point here is not just the religious practices that we do, but it's the way that we live. And the question of Jesus here, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I say?" And this is the core actually of the Hebrew practice. It's not just about knowing God, it's not just about knowing about God, but it's to put into practice the commands of God, the precepts of God, or His advice, His counsels. That's why we're talking about the evangelical counsels. And actually, in our Christian life, we can summarize these commands or counsels in two big blocks: the 10 Commandments and the Beatitudes. These are the two basic teachings of Christ on what our moral life should be beyond our religious practices. So, today Jesus invites us through the gospel to do an examination of conscience, of the fruits of our life. Because when he talks about the figs and the brambles and all that, he's saying that it's impossible for a good tree to bear bad fruit. And it's also impossible for a rotten tree to bear good fruit. So meaning, the way we live, it's going to come out in the fruits of our lives, the effects, if you like. So there are consequences. If we live a good life, a good moral life, there will be good consequences. And if we live a bad moral life, then there will also be consequences that are bad or negative. So it's impossible that if there are negative consequences, that we are living well. And that is the challenge that Jesus is inviting us to also look through. When things go wrong, that we need to examine, am I living the way that Jesus teaches me? And when we talk about the way Jesus teaches me, here he says it's about listening to his commands and doing them. So when things don't turn out right in our lives, there are two questions we need to ask. First, am I doing what Jesus says? And secondly, if we say our answer is yes, then the second question is, do I really know what Jesus is saying to me? Am I really reflecting on his commandments? Or am I presuming that I'm already living the life that Jesus wants me to? And then when things go wrong, it could be very easy to say, why is it that I'm trying to do everything right and things still go wrong? And the deep question there is, have I really listened to what Jesus invites us as Christians to live? So once again, these are the two dynamics that Jesus wants to invite us to examine ourselves regularly, if you like, as Christians. Am I listening right? And am I doing right? So it's not just about doing and doing, but if I don't listen well to what Jesus is really saying, then I might not be doing the right thing. Or I could be listening and listening, but I'm not putting into practice what he's actually telling me. So it's a constant or regular examination of our conscience of whether we're listening right and if we are doing right. And then Jesus promises us, if we listen right and do right, then the fruits should come out right as well. But if the fruits come out wrong, and we see that there are things that seem not to work out according to what the promise of life is all about, then maybe we should examine our listening and our doing as well. So as we continue this reflection, of course, as we define these things that Jesus is saying, it's not a matter of a black and white thing. No, it's not an automatic response. There's, of course, there's gray area. Of course, it's not a mathematical solution, 1 + 1 = 2. There are different things that we need to accept of the uncertainties of life, but these are just general principles for us to know that we are on the right track. And even if we suffer certain events in life, that we would know by this examination if it's just life that happens, or it's maybe something that I can actually change. I can actually control in a certain way and modify in order to seek the life that God gives to us as a gift. So in this line of this examination of conscience that Jesus invites us to as his disciples, as part of Christian life, I'd just like to touch a little bit on the 10 Commandments and bring us into a little reflection, and also the Beatitudes. So once again, I said this could be a bit dense, but I invite you to take your own time to reflect on them. So let's start with the 10 Commandments. Maybe we could start by trying to remember what are the 10 Commandments. I think as Christians, we should have them at our fingertips. And let's try to do it together, okay? Let's see who can remember faster. I mean, it's also a challenge for me to remember them. So what is the first commandment? Of course, God is the only God, and we shall have no idols before him. So no worship of other gods, worshiping God alone. That's the first. Worship God alone. Second, do not misuse the name of God, right? Let's see. The third, what's that? Keep the Sabbath holy. And the fourth, honor your father and your mother. And the fifth, thou shalt not kill. The sixth, thou shalt not commit adultery. The seventh, thou shalt not steal. The eighth, thou shalt not give false witness of your neighbor. The ninth, thou shalt not covet or be jealous or long for the property of your neighbor. And the last, the 10th, thou shalt not covet your neighbor's wife or slaves or animals, etc. So of course, I revised this a little bit before this video, but it's good for us to try to remember them. They're just 10 commandments. And if we try to live according to these 10, we are somehow on the right track. I'll just try to go through them, and let's try to reflect together why these 10 commandments will bring us to positive fruits. If you remember the tree, positive fruits, positive effects or consequences in our lives. So let's try to go through them. The first one, about not having idols, meaning worship God alone. And that one talks about trying not to be the one to be in control, not to try to control everything. What are the idols that we might have? Perhaps it's work. My work could be my idol. Perhaps it's my luxury. My free time could be an idol. Perhaps it's about possessing persons. You know, my husband or wife could be my idol. That I want my children to be with me all the time, and I won't let them free to explore their own lives. So even people, or rather not the person itself, but my possession of the person could be an idol. The opinions of others could be my idol. I could just live for what people think about me, and that could be terrible. So actually the first commandment addresses us, make God your only God. and you will be free from all these distractions or things that take away our peace in life. So do not misuse God's name. I think more than not using curse words or swearing, it's about not blaming God for everything. Not using His name, putting His name for things that we can't explain, and maybe it's not really Him. So that also helps to simplify life a bit, to take personal responsibility for certain things that happen in our life. Third, keeping the Sabbath holy is to dedicate the appropriate time to God, to prayer, to worship. That's why we go to church. That's why we have our daily silent or quiet time to pray, to spend time with scriptures, to take time to rest. And you know, this third commandment has such a great significance for the people of Israel, because work for them, if you remember when they were in Egypt, work meant slavery. And so resting was a sign to remind them, don't be a slave to work. Don't be a slave to your projects in life, your plans. Don't be a slave to yourself or even your pride. Be free. Take a rest. Rest your hearts in God, and then He will put order to everything else. So basically, the 10 commandments are meant to give us an order of freedom in our hearts. As Jesus said in the gospel today, the fruits of our life is because of the order or the disorder in our hearts. And the 10 commandments are meant to put back that order. And so the first one is about putting God in the first place, giving Him the appropriate time, resting our hearts in Him, sharing to Him, talking to Him, praying to Him, entrusting things to Him, reading the scriptures, knowing Him more, loving Him, understanding Him. All this investment in God, putting order to our hearts, to our lives, to our homes, to our churches, our so-called temples, is so important in the first part of the commandments. The next few commandments are more familiar to us because it talks about our moral life with respect to our relationship to others. And I'll just briefly go through them because I just want to emphasize certain things. Honor your father and mother. Actually, this one is kind of like the crucial one before all the rest. I'll explain why. It's somehow connected to keeping the Sabbath holy, about the freedom that we find when we give time to God. But second, the freedom in our relationships, in our own selves, when we put order to our social relationships. There is a certain social order, if you like, in society. And the first order is love for our parents. I mean, the first people that we should respect in the social order of things, of course, are the ones who give us life. So this commandment actually talks not just about our parents, but about social order. When we learn to respect that order, when we invest time to build up those primary relationships in our lives. So if we're married, then it's about the husband or our wife, or if our children, if we have relatives. I mean, it all extends. There's a certain order that we need to respect, to honor, and to love. And so honoring our father and mother is not just about obeying our parents, because that's for children. When we are adults, we don't obey them. But even if we are adults, we need to honor them, because that's the order of relationships, of social relationships that God has given to us, to give order to all our other relationships. And everything flows from that. If we keep that in mind, then the rest makes sense. Thou shalt not kill. If you learn to respect that social order, you will not nourish anger or resentment or hatred in your heart, unforgiveness. So don't kill. And Jesus says don't even get angry, if you remember, meaning don't nourish that anger or resentment or bad relationships. Thou shalt not commit adultery. And this is really something could be less obvious, because this so-called commandment talks about something more hidden in our hearts. Thou shalt not commit adultery. It's talking about lust. And we know in our society today, lust seems to be so condoned as something psychologically acceptable, but we don't realize how subtly lust can destroy relationships. First in marriage, then even in ourselves, the kind of people that we become. St. Paul says in First Corinthians chapter 6, please keep away from sexual immorality, because all other sins that you do, and I quote, happens outside your body. But these sexual sins of lust that we do happen to our body, meaning something happens in us. We become something different when we submit to lust, and it's very gradual, very subtle, and that's why we don't notice it. And perhaps this is where also we can grow in understanding that sometimes things can happen to us when we don't expect, and we kind of question, what happened? And the question we can ask ourselves is, have I kept the commandments? So the 5th commandment, thou shalt not kill. The 6th commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. The 7th commandment, thou shalt not steal. So it's not just about literal stealing, it's talking about greed. It's talking about dishonesty in our livelihood. It's also talking about laziness. Stealing means not just physically I'm stealing, but maybe I'm just lazy to do what is my part, to work. So work is not wrong. Work effort, is part of our gift as human beings, to be able to put in effort to work for the things we need. When we try to find the easy way out, maybe it falls under this commandment, and we don't develop the willpower or the strength of personality when we don't do our part in things. No, thou shalt not steal. And the 8th one, thou shalt not give false witness. We know it's all about lying, about being untruthful, and sometimes being afraid of telling the truth because of the effort or the consequences that come with telling the truth. Maybe to protect ourselves, maybe to protect somebody else in a false way. So again, the gospel teaches us to live in truth, in the peace that, trust God. Trust God in the truth, that when we live the truth, we tell the truth, then things will go in their right way, even though there will be tensions and conflicts normally in the beginning. So that's the 8th commandment. The 9th commandment, do not covet your neighbor's property. Of course, we know that's about jealousy of the success of others. When we compare ourselves with others, when we don't appreciate what we have, we don't appreciate our own gifts, we don't appreciate our own lives. So if you see, there's a lot of wisdom in the 10 commandments, and if we just spend a little bit of time to reflect on them, to ponder on them, we'll see that it makes a lot of sense. We'll see that it kind of orients our hearts, it kind of rehabilitates the desires of our hearts, the motivations that we have, in order that we can build our houses on rock, on strong foundations, as the gospel says today, and to produce good fruits in our lives. And the last one, last but not least, do not covet your neighbor's wife or slaves and etc. It's interesting why the Bible distinguishes the last 2 commandments, coveting your neighbor's property and coveting your neighbor's wife. And it's not just about adultery here. I invite you, if you have time, perhaps it's good also not to explain everything. Try to distinguish the nuance behind coveting your neighbor's things, your neighbor's success, and coveting your neighbor's affections at the affective level or emotional level, coveting the affection that your neighbor has, meaning the wife, slaves, and things, all that. There's another nuance there that is very telling of what can put disorder to our hearts. And if you like, you can summarize these 10 commandments in the 7 capital sins. The disordered desires of our hearts, which are pride, greed, gluttony for things or for food or for whatever, or even pleasures, laziness, lust, anger, and jealousy. So all these different things can be summarized in the Ten Commandments in order to orient our hearts, to put order to our desires, so that we can allow our hearts to guide us to the right things. And as the saying goes, don't just follow your heart, lead it. So if you notice the Ten Commandments, and I'll just describe a little bit of the Beatitudes since we've already talked about it, goes to the heart. It's not just about what you do, but it's about checking why you do what you do, and it's about realizing what you're doing does to you. So I'm sorry for the play of words, but it's really something very deep. What is your doing to you? And why do you do them? And if you really understand these dynamisms in your heart, that is the wisdom that Christ comes to teach us through the Beatitudes. If you notice, the Beatitudes are like the solutions to the do-nots of the Ten Commandments. So the Ten Commandments help us to realize what we should not do and what could be the wrong motivations. And the cure to them are the Beatitudes. So it's really beautiful if you just try to make the connections. The Old Testament has taught us to be aware of what is negative, the do-nots. And the New Testament, of course, the Old Testament also has the focus on freedom. You remember the third and the fourth commandment, keep the Sabbath holy, honor your father and mother, are somehow the core of these two, putting order to our relationship to God and putting order to our social relationships. Okay? But the New Testament goes a step further. Jesus gives us something more about this discipleship of depth. And it's so important to go to the Beatitudes in order not to remain just in the law, in the practices or externals, but to go deep into what Jesus wants to teach us. So if you remember, why don't we do this exercise as well? What are the Beatitudes? Let's try to remember them together. Blessed are, the ones according to Matthew, okay? Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are the humble or the gentle, for they shall inherit the earth. And the third, blessed are those who mourn, those who become sad because of certain things in the world, and they are touched by the world's realities. They shall be comforted. And the fourth, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for justice, and they are restless when they see that things are not going the way they should, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, so not just who hunger for righteousness, but they know how to show mercy, for God will show them mercy as well. The sixth, blessed are the pure of heart, for they shall see God. So being merciful doesn't mean to condone everything and to accept the fragility of human beings only, but to strive to be pure as well. In the midst, as St. Peter says, in the midst of a corrupt generation, that we would still be pure in heart, to shine like stars in the night, in the sky, for people to see an example, because they will see God. They will recognize how God is working. They will recognize God so close to them and very real in their lives. So that's the sixth. The seventh, blessed are the peacemakers. I love this one. For they shall be called children of God. Isn't that the goal of Christian life, to be God's children? Peacemaking, reconciliation, not just with others, but reconciliation with ourselves, reconciliation with God, and of course reconciliation with others, trying to bring people united together in a mature way, not just covering things up, not forgetting all the first few Beatitudes, but learning from Jesus how to reconcile people. That is really an art, that is really a holy act that is not easy, but it's a call for all of us to be children of God. And the eighth, blessed are those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness. That if we do the right thing, we cannot avoid conflict, we cannot avoid misunderstanding, we cannot avoid that there will be criticism, insults even, wrongly given. Now, maybe you're saying, hey, I thought you said that if we do the right thing, then the fruits will be positive. That's true. but there is also healthy suffering, worthy suffering, and you will feel it inside. That even though you suffer outside, you know deep inside that you're doing the right thing, because it's for the good of others. It's for the good in the eyes of God. And of course, Jesus finishes by saying, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of Him, because of their faith, because they believe in Him and they're trying to promote His way of life and they suffer for it." So if you try to combine or you put side by side the Ten Commandments with the Beatitudes, you will notice that the Beatitudes are trying to address the no's or the don't do's or the do nots of the Ten Commandments. And the Beatitudes are saying, do these, the be attitudes, not the attitudes of being, of doing of a Christian. So I invite you as well to try to reflect on the Beatitudes. Try to reflect on the commandments first and see where is the place that I fall most, perhaps, no? Or what is my greatest weakness amongst the Ten Commandments, and which of the Beatitudes actually address these weaknesses or tendencies, perhaps, no, of my heart. There's no need to be ashamed of them. All of us have our weak points, but the courage comes to name those weak points and address them through the Beatitudes. So once again, there's no good tree that produces bad fruit. If we see bad fruit in our spiritual sense in our lives, maybe we need to try to examine again in the commandments something that maybe I'm not practicing. As Jesus says, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I say?" And am I listening right? Have I really examined the commandments in my life? And am I doing what the commandments tell me? So with that examination, it's really a perfect guide. I mean, we are so lucky to be able to be given these commandments, to learn how to orient the desires of our hearts. Because the rotten fruit, as Jesus says, is an expression of what is in my heart. And if I can root out this rottenness from my heart, then only good fruit will come out in my daily life. So I hope that was helpful as a little summary of a discipleship of depth, especially in chapter 6 during this week, when we see that being a disciple is not just about doing religious practices or devotions, good as they are, and we should do them, but it's about going one step further to examine the way we live according to the commandments. In Exodus 20, if you really like to examine them, they're in chapter 20 of the book of Exodus. So the Ten Commandments, the way we live, and the Beatitudes. Okay, it's in Matthew chapter 5, the Beatitudes. So we can try again this week asking God for the grace. Having said all this, it's really a grace. Faith is a gift from God. It's not something that we can earn. It's not something that we can just try to do by our own strength. Well, we can try it, and you can see for yourself. But it's a grace that we need to count on, that we need to ask for. And I leave you with these words from the prophet Jeremiah in the book of Lamentations. Well, you can just try to look it up. Lamentations chapter 5, verse 21. Okay, Lamentations chapter 5, verse 21. Make us come back to you, Lord, and we will come back to you. So if we ask God to give us the grace, to give us the desire to go back to Him, to find the right desires in our hearts, He will give us that grace to help us to find again this path, in order that we can, not just for ourselves, but to be able to guide others around us who need perhaps that help more than we do, to guide them as well, to take the path to go back to the Lord.